What's up, fight fans? Greg Rowe Show Boxing. If you can tell by the title of the video, it is going to be a video about why boxing sucks today. And there are multiple reasons that boxing sucks today. And we're going to get into those. Some of them are exactly why I quit covering fights, while I quit writing about it, why I quit, really in general making videos. Part of it is because boxing's boring. There aren't that many great fights. There aren't that many great fighters. There aren't that many really good fighters fighting other really good fighters kind of in their primes. And all of that sort of leads to the hodgepodge of dysfunction and garbage and what I would consider the worst era of boxing possibly ever. There are a lot of reasons that we're here, right? Part of the reason we're here is, honestly, Floyd Mayweather. He made it cool for fighters to just worry about not losing and maximizing their paydays, and at the detriment of fight fans and fighting guys when you should have fought guys or whatever. Kind of sucked the excitement out of boxing. A lot of guys are trying to follow that blueprint right now, and therefore they're not fighting each other. Really, right now, the one guy that I really respect in the sport of boxing is, Ryan Garcia. And you can, the positive test or whatever. I'm not even sure the test was positive. You have to understand boxing and how boxing works. You have, in the last 50 years, maybe ever in sports history, you have the biggest known cheater in Victor Conti, who created supplements, creams, pills, injections, whatever you want to call them, that were untraceable to give his athletes, more power, more speed, more stamina, more muscle mass, more endurance, all of those sort of things. You have him being allowed to work back in boxing under this new company, Snack, in which he's working with boxing trainers and giving them these supplements. We're not in any way cautious about that, or we're not worried about that. We're not really asking questions. We're just letting it go. You have him helping out with USADA and helping with the testing, and then the guy that his guy lost to all of a sudden pops dirty when he's never popped dirty before or after. Gotcha. But Ryan Garcia is willing to fight anybody. I mean, he's like, bring on Tank, bring on Devin Haney, bring on Raleigh. He's willing to fight any of these guys in or around his weight class while they're young and in their prime, just like he is. And boxing needs more of that. Like him, hate him, have no opinion on Ryan Garcia. The way Ryan Garcia is going about his business and the fights that he's giving fans is what other stars in boxing need to be doing. They need to be following that blueprint. That's the way it used to be done. Guys weren't afraid of a loss because they wanted to test themselves against the best and prove that they were better than the other guy. That's what boxing is about. But now it's about how much money can I make? Can I maximize my money while minimizing the risk? And that's all due to Floyd Mayweather. You can be a fan of the guy. You can hate me for saying that. That is the fact of where we are at. Another thing is that boxing just doesn't really have any great fighters. Manny came back, so Manny is an all-time great fighter. Canelo is an all-time great fighter. Guys like Usyk and Crawford are not all-time great fighters. I'm sorry, they're not. They're not all-time great fighters. They don't have the resumes. Okay, they don't have the resumes. And that will bring me to my next point, right? The first point is that boxing is boring. That second point is Floyd Mayweather gave a blueprint of how to maximize your money and minimize your risk, and therefore nobody wants to fight anybody. The third part of this is that boxing doesn't have any really great fighters right now outside of a beyond old and washed up Pacquiao and a Canelo that's on the back nine. Okay, getting into the other issue, which would be part 4 of why we're where we are at, is that because we are in such a weak era of boxing, because boxing doesn't really have any superstars outside of the guys I named, it doesn't have any guys that would be all-time great fighters in any era outside of the few guys that I named. What we have done is we have taken, and I mean boxing media members, commentators, promoters, trainers, and for the large part, boxing fans have taken these good fighters or really good fighters and made good fighters really good fighters and made really good fighters great fighters. Because there's nothing else that they can do in order to explain the lack of what we're seeing. So they just say, this guy's an all-time great fighter. And the 2 examples I gave are Usyk and Crawford. Probably 1 and 2 pound for pound in the world right now. In a way, could be on that list too, in that mix. I'm fine with that. As far as resume and whatnot, he may be the most impressive of the 3. And just because you don't know the names doesn't mean they're not great names. That's a you problem. That's not a him problem. If you look at Crawford, for example, he just beat Canelo, moved up a couple weight classes to do so. I always said Crawford was going to win the fight. Canelo has and has always had a problem with crafty boxers that make him miss, can counterpunch, that have fast hands that he just can't sit there and walk down and beat on, right? Especially as he gets older, that's going to continue to be a problem with him. I don't know if we'll see him in the ring with another guy like that. If I was advising him, I would just say, hey, let's go make some easy, exciting fights and get out of the game. You have nothing left to prove. But the biggest names on Crawford's resume are Canelo and obviously Spence. All the Spence fight did, and again, I picked Crawford to win that fight before it was ever announced. All it did was just show that Spence was overrated, right? Yeah, he had some good wins, against some guys that were kind of, names, and again, kind of in the mid-tier to back 9 of their careers, which made him kind of look better than he really was. But I saw all the holes that were there. I saw the mistakes that he made, and I knew that if he got in there with a guy like Crawford, that it would get exposed, and he was exposed, and now he's MIA. So that's one of the the biggest names on his resume. And then you got Canelo, who is an all-time great fighter, who's on the back 9. There was nothing that Crawford did to Canelo that was any more convincing or impressive than what Bivol did to him. Right? So Bivol does this to him, and it's like, oh, wow, well, that was an upset. Well, and then Crawford does it. It's like, oh, my. Crawford just put himself in the upper echelon of boxing. He's up there with the 4 kings. He's up there with Mayweather. He's up there with Pacquiao and Ray Leonard and Ray Robinson and Chavez and, De La Hoya and Mosley and, Roy Jones. No, he's not. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, Bivol did it. Crawford did it. You could honestly say that Bivol did it even more impressively, and he didn't even get close to the hype that Crawford got for beating Canelo. That's how desperate the boxing writers, the boxing experts, the commentators, the fans, whatever, are to crown somebody like Crawford a great fighter, an all-time great fighter in this era. right? Just like sit and think about that for a second. So the two biggest names on his resume are Spence, who was clearly overrated, is now MIA, and Canelo, who's on the back nine, and he did the same thing that Bivol did a couple years ago to a younger Canelo. Getting into, well, even before getting into Usyk, like the things I'm seeing are that, and this was after he beat Spence. This wasn't even just after beating Canelo. It was that Crawford is as good as the Four Kings, that he is up there with the greatest pound-for-pound fighters of all time. He's not. He's not. He's got a great skill set for this era of boxing, which is weaker. If you go back and throw Terrence Crawford into, 135 to 168 pounds in the 90s or the early 2000s, and he's got to go through guys like, even the 80s, he's got to go through Duran and Leonard and Hagler and Hearns and De La Hoya and Mosley and Whitaker and Chavez and Meldrick Taylor. And he's got to go through guys like Julian Jackson or Mike McCollum or, Eubanks or Ben or, Roy Jones, or he's got to go through Mayweather or Pacquiao or Mosley. Even guys like Ike Corte, Fernando Vargas, Winky Wright. He's got to go through guys like that. You think he's going to be 2-0, 43-0, and have all these titles and collect all these belts and do something that nobody in the history of boxing has done? Fuck to the no. And you're retarded if you think that. The reason he's done things that nobody else in the history of boxing has done is because he's a great fighter in an extremely weak era. If he had to run through the names that I just said, even fight half of them, a third of those guys, he has L's all over his resume. L's all over his resume. Seriously, could you imagine him, in the middleweight, super middleweight division fighting guys like James Toney, Marvin Hagler, Hopkins, Roy Jones, McClellan, McCollum. Could Julian Jackson? Could you imagine that? Can you imagine if Julian Jackson hit Crawford on the jaw? What are we talking about here? But we're saying this guy is an all-time great fighter, and he's up there with all those guys. He's not. What he is a great fighter with a great skill set that is benefiting from and fighting in the weakest era of boxing ever. That is the same thing with Usyk. The same thing with Usyk. This last fight, people were saying that they were trying to compare him to Muhammad Ali and how would a super fight between him and Ali go, or him and Tyson, or him and Joe Louis, or him and Larry Holmes. What? I'll run through the same thing. The two biggest names on his resume are Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. Both of those guys, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, would be C-level fighters. They would be considered journeymen. They would be a guy that would get a title shot every once in a while. Maybe they would get a lucky punch or something like that, like Corey Saunders or whatever did, like Oliver McCall did, and win a title. But they wouldn't be gatekeepers of the heavyweight division. They wouldn't be, they're the heavyweight champion, they're the lineal heavyweight champion. Think about this. If you look at the history of boxing, you look at, obviously guys like Corbett and John L. Sullivan, guys like that, were small heavyweights. They were, 5'8", 5'9", 170, 185 pounds, whatever. They were small heavyweights. It was a different era of boxing. So to compare, guys like, Fury, Joshua, Usyk to those guys, just to me doesn't make sense. There's such a huge gap in not only boxing technology and training and nutrition and the physical and the training aspects of boxing, that it just doesn't make sense to compare them. But if you look at all-time great heavyweights like Jack Dempsey, Jack Johnson, you look at guys like Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, Ezzard Charles, Joe Walcott, Archie Moore. You go to Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston and Ali and Holmes and Norton and Frazier and Foreman and Tyson and Bo and Holyfield and Lennox Lewis and the Klitschko brothers. Like all those guys I just named, how many of those guys would Usyk beat? How many of those fights would he be the favorite in? Hardly any. Hardly any. But we're talking about what we feel like this guy would do against Muhammad Ali, what this guy would do against Mike Tyson. Like, are you guys serious? That's where we're at with boxing? That's how shitty this era is, that's what we're talking about? We're comparing Usyk, who again has a pretty shitty resume, but great accomplishments, because just like Crawford, he's a really good fighter that is benefiting from fighting in the weakest era in the history of boxing. We're going to compare him to Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Joe Louis, Larry Holmes. Like, what are we doing? This is why boxing sucks, because you have low IQ boxing commentators, writers. The internet is just saturated with people who feel like they can do this because they own a camera and they have a social media account and all this stuff, that they can just talk boxing. And they give out bad information, they put out bad takes, and they maybe garner a little following, and these little minions eat up what they say and they just regurgitate it, and it's just a spiral of low IQ things being spewed by low IQ people. And all of these things in combination that I just talked about is why boxing sucks. It's why I got out of it. It's why I don't cover fights anymore. It's why I don't go to fights anymore. It's why I don't watch it religiously like I used to. It's why I don't talk about it very often. Because it just sucks. And it sucks for all of those reasons. I mean, it doesn't matter if you disagree with what I said. You can't say what I said is wrong. You can't say that I'm lying. You can't say that it's made up, because I see it every single day. I hear it every single day. I've watched boxing for basically 40 years. 40 years live. And the years that I obviously wasn't alive for, like I wasn't alive, during, the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or the 40s or the 30s. I wasn't, sorry. But I've gone back and I've watched those fights and I've watched those fighters and I've studied, the footwork, and I've studied, the art of boxing and how guys used to be and how they used to fight. And, things like the art of shifting that, Dempsey would use, like Golovkin used that, but that's it's a lost art that is not there anymore. You're not seeing the level of boxing trainers you used to see. You're not seeing the level of fighters you used to see. You're not seeing the level of promotion that you used to see. You're not seeing the level of commentation and fight breakdowns and everything that you used to see. Outside of guys like Andre Ward, that, really, Roy Jones, that were really great fighters. They can really break it down for you. The average boxing commentator that is just a nobody is a moron. Like, honestly, they just are. Jake Paul. Jake Paul is another example of why boxing sucks. This guy's fights are being watched. They're being promoted as real fights. And he really has only been in one real fight. And that was against Tommy Fury, and he lost. Everything other than that has been a sideshow. It's been a carnival sideshow attraction. And this latest fight against Tank Davis is the same thing. Like, he's promoting it as it's dangerous because Tank is a pound-for-pound fighter. Tank is 5'6", fights at 135 pounds. Jake Paul walks around probably 220, 225. I mean, there's going to be a 50-pound weight advantage. That's not a real fight. But new age boxing fans, because social media is all the rage, They act like he's a real fighter and these are real fights. That's another reason boxing sucks. So that's it. That's why boxing sucks. Those 5 or 6 things are why boxing sucks. Don't care if you disagree. They're factual. They're realistic. I see them every day. I hear it every day. And that is why in 2025, moving forward, unless something drastically changes, why boxing will continue to suck.